Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the August 2024 U.S. History and Government Regents exam. In this video, we're going to be covering part 1, which are the first 28 multiple choice questions. A link to this test can be found in the description of this video if you want to follow along at home. That being said, we're going to start off with number 1, which asks which statement is best supported by the information in this chart. So this chart pretty much displays the European and Native American populations in early America. We see that when Europeans first came to America, they came in very small numbers, but at the end of the century, in the year 1700, their numbers grew a lot, right? Exponentially, right? So, for example, the English in Virginia, they started off with only 100 people, but by the 1700s, they had 72,000 people. That's a crazy increase. And that increase is true for the French and Spanish, so their population skyrocketed. Meanwhile, the native population in the year 1610 started off with very large numbers, but by the 1700s, their numbers heavily decreased, right? So they had the increase in the population of Europeans and the decrease in the population of Native Americans. So which statement is best supported by the information in this chart? Well, it can't be one because there wasn't a steady growth of both European and Native American populations. If there was a steady growth of both European and Native American populations, there wouldn't be a drop in the Native American populations. It would grow. We wouldn't go from 20,000 to only 100, right? That's a decrease, not a growth. 2. Native Americans aided Europeans for almost 90 years. This one is also false because this shows no relationship between the two populations. We don't know how they interacted. This table, this chart, doesn't support any sort of interactions that Native Americans and Europeans had. It just shows us their population numbers, which is why choice 3 is the correct answer. We don't know how this decrease happened, right? We can assume, we can use our knowledge of U.S. history and say, well, yes, Europeans would have fought over the lands with native populations and would have kicked them out, or they would have spread diseases and had superior technology which would have wiped them out in any sort of conflicts. But we need to say the statement that is best supported by the information in the chart. The information in the chart only tells us about population. When someone's population goes down, that's a very bad thing. So European colonization had devastating effects on Native Americans. Yeah, as the Europeans colonized and grew their population in new worlds that weren't theirs, the native population decreased. And because it's decreasing, it's a very bad thing. And because it decreased by so much, it was a devastating decrease, and thus it had devastating effects on Native Americans. Number 4 is wrong because the French and Indian War impacted both Europeans and Native Americans. This has nothing to do with the French and Indian War, right? This does not explicitly state anything about the French and Indian War, okay? Whenever they're asking you what is supported by the chart, you could only look at what's in the chart. The only thing that's in the chart, it isn't interactions, it's not wars, it's population. Whenever a population goes down, that's going to be a bad thing, right? So European colonization had devastating effects on Native Americans because they made the population go so low. Now, number 2 asks us, what is the main cause of the population trend shown in the chart? So what is the cause behind this trend? We're no longer making a statement based on this chart. We're trying to explain this statement with our own knowledge of U.S. history. And the correct answer is going to be choice 4. The diseases and technology brought by Europeans to the Americas caused this drastic decrease in their population. The diseases of the old world, the diseases of England and Europe as a whole, those Europeans were already exposed to those diseases. They had some sort of immunity. You had to treat them. All of a sudden, the Native Americans did not know them. They were never exposed to those diseases. They were never exposed to this technology of the old world. So when all of that was introduced, a lot of the native populations got sick and died off very quickly because they had no exposure to those old world diseases. At the same time, when Europeans and Native Americans would fight, the Europeans would have superior technology, which would lead to devastating casualties on the Native American population in those conflicts, right? Choice 1, again, we're not talking about indentured servants, we're talking about native populations. Choice 2 is wrong because disputes between the British and the French over land would have effects on the British and the French. Additionally, that wouldn't kill most of the Native American populations off. Sure, some Native American populations were involved in territorial disputes, but just territorial disputes alone was not enough to bring their population this far down, right? That had to have been diseases and technological differences. And certainly 3, the growing number of African Americans brought to the colonies had nothing to do with this change either. Moving on to number 3 and 4. It says, notices such as this published in the Virginia Gazette in 1775 demonstrated what? So let's read this. Just arrived. The Justitica, Captain Kidd, with about 130 healthy servants, consisting of men, women, and boys, among whom were tradesmen such as carpenters and joiners, bricklayers, plasterers, shoemakers, barbers, and hairdressers, several weavers, cutlers, curriers, and bakers, a tanner, a tailor, a staymaker, a blacksmith, a painter, a printer, a bookbinder, a miller, a stock weaver, a schoolmaster, a hatter, a silk dryer, and others. There are also many farmers and other country laborers, gentlemen's servants, etc., etc. The sale will commence at the Leeds town on Wednesday, 22nd instant, and continue till all are sold. A reasonable credit will be allowed to the purchasers giving bonds with approved security to Thomas Hodge. So this is telling us the arrival of indentured servitudes into the New World, right? As populations in the New World and the Americas increased, there was an increased demand for skilled laborers. These laborers would escape the old world and be as indentured servants, right? So they did not have the money to leave Europe, but they would come to America and work for a family that would pay back their trip. So they would be a servant for maybe 10 or 15 years to pay back the debt that they incurred from crossing from Europe to America. And once that debt was paid off, they would be given a share of land and some money to live on in the New World, right? So this Gazette shows the arrival of those skilled laborers. So that shows how a skilled labor force was emigrating to British North America, right? These are all tradesmen. Tradesmen are people who are capable of doing skilled labor, right? Carpenters, jointers, bricklayers, right? That's not an everyday person can't do that. You need some sort of training for that. And that would be skilled labor, right? If you're able to make a table or lay a brick wall, right? That's a certain skill that makes you a skilled worker, right? So the New World needed them, so people would see this increase in demand for those jobs and emigrate from the Old World to the New World in that fashion, right? So 2 is wrong because impoverished Europeans were being denied entry to America. This is false because they were being accepted entry into America, right? People were hiring them and buying their labor, as shown by this Gazette, right? 3, an extreme shortage of plantation workers existed in the South. This has nothing to do with the South or plantation workers, right? These are tradesmen. These are skilled workers. They would not be working on a plantation. They would be working for a family. 4, northern economies were growing at a faster rate than those in the South. Again, this has nothing to do with this Gazette, right? This has nothing to do with the economy. This has something to do with the demand of labor and at that skill labor, right? This is too early to see a major divide between the North and the South. Number 4 says, based on this notice, what were the main reasons that immigrants were willing to enter into years of indentured servitude in British North America? So like I said before, you had all these poor Europeans who got sick of living in Europe and wanted to come over to America. They couldn't afford going over to America, but people who were currently living in America who wanted their labor were willing to pay for their voyage, and in return, those indentured servants would work for that family for a decade, maybe 15 years, 5 years, for a set contract, and at the end of their work, they would be awarded freedom and land. So the whole reason behind this is that they believed they could eventually prosper in the colonies. The reason why you would leave England to go into America is, well, I can't get any land in England. I can't get a good living in England. But maybe if I work for this family as an indentured servant and I come out of it alive, they'll give me land. And if I own my own land, I could start my own farm, my own business, and I'll be very happy and happier than I was in England. Again, so people emigrated to the New World in search of better opportunities. Okay, choice 1 is false. They wouldn't have let a criminal cross, right? 3, they could immediately pay off the debt they owed to colonial sponsors. This is false. The debt that they paid to the sponsors, the people who paid for their voyage, would take like 10 to 5 years, 15 to 10 years, very, very long time of working. It certainly wasn't immediate. And choice 4 is wrong because they were facing severe hardship as a result of the Great Famine. Again, that was not the main reason why people from Britain came to British North America, right? Sure, there were famines, but that wasn't the main motivator, right? They just wanted to have a better life in a new world, and they thought they could get that. So for number 5 and 6, we have to read this passage here. It said, at a very large and respectable meeting of freeholders and freemen in the city and county of Philadelphia, on June 18, 1774, Thomas Willing, John Dickinson, chairman, resolved the Act of Parliament for shutting down the port of Boston is unconstitutional and oppressive to the inhabitants of the town, dangerous to the liberties of the British colonies, and therefore considering our brethren at Boston as suffering in the common cause of America. That, too, that a Congress of Deputies from several colonies in North America is the most probable and proper mode of procuring relief for our suffering brethren and obtaining redress of American grievances, securing our rights and liberties, and reestablishing peace and harmony between Great Britain and the colonies. So I'm going to stop reading here. This is describing a meeting that occurred after the British shut down the port of Boston. So we all know about the Boston Tea Party. People, gathered in a group called the Sons of Liberty, and they were opposing a British tariff or tax on tea. And in order to not boycott, but protest this added tax on tea, they decided to sneak into the Boston Harbor. They took up a lot of crates of tea on a ship, and they threw them overboard, resulting in all the tea really being damaged. This really angered Great Britain because they just lost a crazy amount of money. They were supposed to deliver that tea and make money off that tea, but because it's in the harbor, it's all ruined now. And the way that they decided to punish the colonists was by shutting down the entire port. Remember that it wasn't just the British that used the port of Boston, it was the colonists themselves, right? They used the port of Boston to trade with other parts of the colonies and the West Indies. So all of a sudden, when this big port was shut down, the people of Boston, lost a lot of jobs. They lost a lot of their economy was operating through this port. When that port was shut down, a lot of jobs were lost, a lot of money was lost, a lot of economies were lost. So people were very, very upset at this, right? And they saw it as tyrannical. They're like, well, what right do you have to shut down our port when we weren't even given a way to express our grievances or express our issues with your government in the first place, right? People thought it was unfair. The colonists said that we made a statement and we protested against you, and you're once again not fairly punishing us, right? So choice 5, or number 5, says that the June 1774 meeting of Philadelphia freedmen was called a direct result of choice 1, right? Great Britain's punishment of Boston for the destruction of British tea, right? Any single time you see the closure of the Boston port, that's going to be a result of the Boston Tea Party, the punishment of the Boston Tea Party. Choice 2 is most certainly wrong. They don't want to elect a British king. 3 and 4 none of them make sense, right? So 6 asks us, how did the Pennsylvania resolutions move the colonies toward independence? Well, you can see here that they're asking to have a say in the government, right? And they're asking for the British to go back to the old way of governing them, right? We want to go back to the British monarchy that didn't tax us 24/7. We want to go back to the British monarchy that actually gave us freedom, and gave us the liberty to purchase stuff without tariffs and do as we please. We don't want these tariffs. We don't want these acts. We don't want you sniffing down our neck 24/7, because we want our personal freedoms. So pretty much what these meetings did and what the British oppression did was it unified America into being against Britain. It was like, hey, you're unhappy about Britain, I'm unhappy about Britain. Why don't we align together and be against what the British are doing to us? So choice 4, they aided in the process of unifying the colonists to defend traditionalist rights. People saw this event and they were horrified. They're like, well, what right does Britain have to punish the entire city of Boston for the actions of few? And what right do they have to take away any of our rights? We want to go back to the old way of British governance, which was when they just let us do our own thing, right? The colonies did not want to close the harbor to international trade. They did not want to censor Boston for destroying valuable British property. They didn't censor Boston. They tried to aid Boston. They understood what people from Boston would be experiencing with the port being shut down. Choice 3 is wrong. They ordered that the citizens of Pennsylvania contribute to relief for fellow colonists. That is not stated anywhere in this text, okay? All right, so 7 and 8 come from this text here, and it says that the source is the Anti-Federalist number 46, right? So that's a publication of an anti-federalist piece of writing. So it says, but to question without force what can restrain Congress from making such laws as they please, what limits are there to their authority? I fear none at all. For surely it cannot be justly said that they have no power, but what is expressly given to them, when by the terms of their creation they are vested in the powers of making law, in all cases necessary and proper. When they have the nature of the power, they must necessarily be judges they must necessarily be the judges what laws are necessary and proper. So anti-federalist people who wrote in the Anti-Federalist, which is this collection of anti-federalist writing, was the main justification that anti-federalists had, right? People who opposed federalism. Federalism wanted was this ideology that said that if America was to unite, the federal government should have more power than the states, right? If we are to function as a country and we want to continue as a country, the federal government should have more control over the states. Anti-federalists believe that the states should have more control than the government, right? Ultimately, the federalist won, right? The U.S. federal government still exists today and has a lot more power over the states. But what the anti-federalists wanted was they wanted the states to have more power than the federal government, right? They thought that having a federal government would be no better than a monarchy, that it would be corrupt, that it would infringe upon the states' rights, people would have their rights taken away. And in this paragraph, we can kind of see that. We're like, well, if Congress, which is a part of the federal government, if Congress can make all the laws, how can the states oppose those laws? If you give this one body of power all the power to make the laws, how is that going to be fair to any of the states? So 7 asks us, based on this passage, why did anti-federalists oppose the ratification of the Constitution? And that's because the legislative branch had too much power, right? The main concern about the anti-federalists was that, well, if we give the central government or the federal government too much power, we won't have any rights. The whole reason why we can't trust the federal government is because they will have too much power and we cannot give them too much power. The states want most of the power or deserves most of the power. So again, here, for all, surely it cannot be justly said that they have no power, but what is to expressly give them, right? So here it's like it's saying that the Constitution will give Congress power that they don't deserve, right? That they didn't earn, power that allows them to ignore the saying and the opinions of the states and the citizens of those states, right? So number 8 asks, which action was taken to deal with the criticism expressed in the passage? So how did Federalists convince Anti-Federalists to unify under a government that was stronger than the state governments? Well, they added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, right? Federalists saw that, hey, okay, sure, maybe they think that our new federal government will take away from their rights. How do we convince them that it won't take away from their rights? Well, we'll add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This Constitution, which pretty much gave the federal government more power over the states, also has a section which defends the rights of the American people, right? The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments: freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, right? All of these amendments were here to make sure that even though Congress could make the laws, people could still oppose them, people can still express how they feel, and people can still have some unalienable rights and freedoms that a stronger government simply cannot take away from them, right? Choice 3, the elastic clause was never eliminated. Choice 2, given states the ability to check the power of Congress. That is not true. That is not what happens. And 1, assigning the power of judicial review to the Supreme Court. That's also not what allowed them. That's not how they dealt with the criticism that's being expressed in this passage, right? The criticism in this passage is that, well, Congress will have too much power and they'll take away the rights from the citizens. So how do we protect the rights of the citizens? Well, I guess we'll add an entire section into the Constitution which creates Congress, which says that our citizens will be protected. All right. So this is an excerpt from Marbury v. Madison. Chief Justice Marshall establishes the precedent that the Supreme Court can do what? So let's read it. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply a rule to particular cases must, of necessary, explain and interpret that rule. If 2 laws conflict with each other, the court must decide an operation of each. So if a law be in opposition to the Constitution, if both the law and the Constitution apply to a particular case, so that the court must either decide that case comfortably, according to law, disregarding the Constitution or comfortably to the Constitution disregarding the law. The court must determine which of these conflicting rules governs the case. This is of the very essence of judicial duty. If then the courts are to regard the Constitution, and the Constitution is superior to any ordinary act of legislature, the Constitution and not such ordinary act must govern the case to which both apply. So Marbury v. Madison is what established judicial review, right? Judicial review establishes the Supreme Court's power to declare a law or an action unconstitutional. Remember that the U.S. Constitution is the is the ultimate law of the land. There are no state laws that can go above or are more important than whatever is stated in the Constitution, right? If something goes against the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. So let's say that if you were involved in a court case that, took away your freedom of speech, or some other constitutional right was violated, you will have the Supreme Court was there to say, hey, that ruling was, even though the ruling was lawful, even though the ruling did follow a given law, that law is invalid because it goes against the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution, right? So what Marbury v. Madison does is it says, well, how do we make sure that laws are in tune with the Constitution? Well, we can establish the Supreme Court, which does judicial review, which looks at laws and says, are these constitutional or not? So number 9 says, it sets the precedent that the Supreme Court can overturn laws that violate the Constitution. That's all they did, right? It gives the Supreme Court the power to look at laws and say, hey, well, even though this law was made, this takes away your rights, which makes it unconstitutional. And in an attempt to support and protect the rights of the people of the United States of America, we declare that this law is not good anymore, right? Choice 2 doesn't make sense. May disregard the Constitution in their decision making. That is false, right? The whole point of this is to uphold the Constitution, because the Constitution is the law of the land, right? This is what everyone should follow. 3 and 4, neither of those make sense, right? Because this is only dealing with laws and judicial review. So this is a very important case that you guys should remember. Marbury v. Madison. All that said is it gave the the Supreme Court a crazy amount of power. So 10 says, what is one important consequence of the Supreme Court's decision in Marbury v. Madison? Well, it's the power of the judicial branch was expanded. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court, is the only part of America or of America's government that can say that can just invalidate a law. Sure, Congress can make laws, and the president can enforce those laws, but the people who say those laws are fair are the Supreme Court. And if you're the people who are declaring whether laws are fair or not, you're in a very, very, very powerful position, right? Because even if you disagree with the law, you can just say, hey, it's unconstitutional, and we can get rid of it, right? The people who declare whether the laws are fair or not ultimately have the most power. This, Marbury v. Madison, gave the Supreme Court that specific right, which is why it expanded the power of the Supreme Court so much. So choice 4 is false because that's not what was given towards Marbury v. Madison. Choice 2 and 1 also both are false because, again, Marbury v. Madison just expanded the power of the Supreme Court by establishing judicial review. 11 asks, what was one primary characteristic of slavery in the United States? So is it 1, an American slave child did not attend school until age 10. That's false. American slave children did not attend school at all. They would be, subjugated to hard labor and then further hard labor in their life. They would not be educated. Slave owners did not educate their slaves. They thought they would be afraid that if they educated their slaves, they would be able to rebel more effectively. Choice 2, family members would usually remain together after they were sold at auction. That's false, right? The whole, one of the most horrific parts about slavery is that families were sold to different slave owners, right? So it tore families apart. Not only did it displace families from Africa, but it also tore them apart after they were sold. 3, the condition of slavery was passed from generation to generation. This is true, right? The primary characteristic is that if your father was a slave and you were born to a slave, you would also be a slave. It doesn't matter whether or not you were born in America or taken from Africa. As long as you were born to a slave, you would be a slave. And choice 4 is also false. You would be a slave for your entire life unless you were freed. 12. Which three individuals and historians most likely study the conjunction in this passage? So this is from Frederick Douglass, right? Who was a very big abolitionist. Okay, so in essence, which three individuals would would agree with and study what Frederick Douglass had to say? Right? You don't need to read this to understand this question. You need to know that Frederick Douglass was a very big abolitionist. He hated slavery. He opposed slavery with every bit of himself, and he would often publish these papers and writings. He was a former slave who got freed, and he pretty much spent his entire life saying that slavery is terrible. This is my experience with slavery. Slavery not only doesn't make any sense, but it's also un-American. So he posted and gave speeches and published all of these writings to kind of sway America to abolishing slavery. He was an abolitionist. Those were people who wanted to abolish or make slavery unlawful. So here, that's what he's saying, right? The slavery doesn't make any sense in America. It's really cruel. It's horrible. So which individuals would agree with this statement? That would be choice 2. Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Tubman were all figures in abolition, right? These were all people who supported the fight against slavery, right? Choice 1, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford were people who owned the monopolies during the Gilded Age. 3, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, and Jacob Riis were people who were muckrakers, people who opposed Rockefeller and Carnegie during the Gilded Age. And choice 4 has nothing to do with slavery either, right? Um, these people were later in the 1900s, right? This was 1900, 1900, 1900. These are the only people from 1800, and these are the only abolitionists who are listed as an answer choice. 13 said Congress enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act so that what? Well, I was talking about this in the last problem because one of our answer choices here described the people who formed these large trusts, right, or monopolies. So eventually, during the Gilded Age, what happened in America is that they had laissez-faire economics, right? The government was very hands off with the economy, right? If someone wanted to form a monopoly or have unfair business tactics, they were free to do that. And what ended up happening is that a lot of U.S. steel, U.S. or Standard Oil came up, and those were very, very large conglomerations, right? Very, very large companies that pretty much bought all their competitions to the point where if you wanted to buy oil, you only had to buy from Standard Oil. If you wanted to buy steel, you'd only have to buy from U.S. Steel, right? They pretty much dominated the market and made it impossible for local businesses or anyone else to sell what they were selling. And on top of that, they were able to treat their workers terribly because, well, they owned all the jobs in that industry and the workers couldn't go anywhere else. So eventually what the U.S. government decided to do was they decided to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act to eliminate or to bust all these large monopolies which were dominating the economy and harming their workers and harming the local businesses. So what it did was it ensured that business practices attempted to eliminate the competition could be regulated, right? The whole issue with a monopoly is that you can't compete with anyone else. If you have a monopoly on an industry, you can make the price incredibly high. You can mistreat your workers. You can limit the amount of products that you produce. Why? Because you have a monopoly, no one else is going to produce those products and you're able to do whatever you want. So monopolies are very bad for business. So the US government decided to step in and bust these monopolies. So they passed that so that business practices that attempted to eliminate competition could be regulated, right? That is what a trust is, right? Trusts are big monopolies that eliminate competition, right? 1 and 2 have nothing to do with the size of a business. And choice 4, trade with foreign nations could be restricted. This has nothing to do with foreign trade. If you were to read this, again, you can pretty much see that they are trying to reverse the large monopolies formed during that time. 14 asks us the greatest weakness of the Anti-Sherman Trust Act was that it what? Well, it's that it contained vague wording and could not easily be enforced. The reason why this really didn't make much of a difference in America is because, look at this, right? Every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade and commerce among several states with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. Every person who shall make any such contract or engage in such a combination or conspiracy shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $5,000, or by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or by both punishment at the discretion of the court. So again, what is the exact punishment? Are you being fined or are you being put in prison? And also, what's happening to your business? If you were found guilty of starting a trust, would that trust be dissolved, or would you still keep that trust but you would just go to prison? You can kind of see here that this contained vague wording, right? What happens to the trust that it's formed? I only know what happens to the person that forms the trust, but is the company, the monopoly that they formed, still going to be present? Well, we don't know, right? So, like a lot of issues with the law, it's often vaguely worded and could not be easily enforced, right? Choice 2 is false because this has nothing to do with an unreasonable fine. You cannot really call a fine unreasonable if it's if it's stated by Congress, right? That's kind of the law of the land. 3, denied individuals the right to trial if accused of violating the act. That's obviously false, right? If it's a law, you can be tried for it. 4, exempted the companies that lobbied members of Congress. Again, you cannot say that's true here because we don't have any information about companies that lobbied Congress, or essentially companies that came into Congress and tried to convince them otherwise by paying them money. Right? So here we have a chart that describes United States immigrations from 1820 to 2009. So based on the graph, the largest number of immigrants came to the United States during periods of what? Well, when were these peaks? Well, our first peak in the number of immigrants coming into America was during the 1900s to 1909. And another big peak was during 1800 to 1889. And here we have some modern day peaks from 2000 to 2009. So what's the common denominator between these time periods? Well, it's during economic growth in the United States, right? What happened during the 1910s to 1919s, right? It was the Roaring 20s. It was major economic growth. What happened during the 1880s to 1889? Well, these large trusts, U.S. oil, U.S. steel formed, and American exports grew very, very, very quickly. What happened during 1920 to 1929? Or sorry, around 1930 and 1929, the Great Depression, right? America was in a very, very, its economy was in a crazy, terrible shape, right? So is the number of immigrants there also dropped, also because of a world war. But again, you can see how during times of economic prosperity, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the amount of immigrants that are arriving into America is increasing, right? And the best way of supporting that is through these 3 peaks, which are happening during great economic expansion within the country. Number 16 says that the main reason for the declining immigration in the 1920s was that the United States did what? Well, it enacted quotas to limit immigration from select nations, right? Eventually, the immigration in America reached such a point that we passed the Quota Act, which pretty much limited the amount of immigrants coming from other nations to a set number, right? Only 3,000 British people can come. Only 5,000 Russians can enter our country, right? People in America grew a very anti-immigration sentiment because they thought it was destroying their country, right? So people from Europe during this time, again, when I highlighted these peaks, what was happening is that America was having a very good economy, and people from across the world saw this and were like, maybe I can, hit it big in America, right? They have a very good economy. They have a lot of jobs, a lot of economic expansion from the big monopolies and the introduction of the stock market. Maybe I can make it big there. So all of these people who were experiencing poverty in the rest of the world and poverty in their old countries decided to come to America to chase these opportunities, to the point where so many of them came into the country that America, grew anti-immigrant sentiment and decided to kick them out of major cities and limit their flow through immigration acts, which is why through the 1920s to 1940s you saw a very slow rate of immigration in America. right? Weather conditions had nothing to do with this. Um, and again, if you're reducing the pay of foreign workers would have still come. Same thing as choice 4. So in this case, we have a political cartoon. We have Woodrow Wilson, which was the president of the United States during and after World War One. We have the League covenants, and he's trying to stop this lumberjack called the Senate from chopping down this tree, right? So Woodrow Wilson was a very big proponent or supporter of the League of Nations, right? After World War One, Woodrow Wilson was like, hey, maybe future conflicts like world wars wouldn't come about and wouldn't happen if we had a League of Nations, pretty much a precursor or an idea of the UN where nations can come together and talk their issues out through diplomacy, right, rather than through war. So the League of Nations was the pretty much the founding idea for the UN. However, when Woodrow Wilson tried to start it, it was very unsupported by Americans, and it was a very, very weak league that didn't really go anywhere, right? And we can see this because the Senate really didn't support it. So the author of this political cartoon is trying to say how the Senate is going to chop down this League of Nations, right? So 17 asks us which constitutional principle is the focus of this cartoon. Well, that's going to be, checks and balances. Why? Because the president can't just go up and say, hey, I'm going to start my own international league, right? Other parts of the U.S. government are there to keep his decisions in check, right? To make sure that the decisions that the president makes are the ones that the nation needs, not the ones that he specifically needs. So in this case, Woodrow Wilson wanted to start the League of Nations, but the rest of the government and the rest of the country didn't want to. So his decision to start it was overruled by the Senate. So his desire to do something was checked, or his power was checked and balanced by the Senate, who represented the sentiment of Americans who did not want, and the majority of Americans who did not want to create the League of Nations, right? So 18 asks us, what was one reason for the Senate's action illustrated in the cartoon, right? And that's because there were fear of becoming involved in another European war. At the end of the First World War, America decided to kind of withdraw or step back from the rest of Europe. They had a very good economy, a very strong economy, and they did not want to engage in another war. They didn't want to engage in more European affairs that would drive them to more wars that would reduce the number of Americans, right? They would kill a bunch of Americans. America wanted to be its own independent and free agent, right? Choice 1, it was not unconstitutional for a president to negotiate a treaty. Countless presidents have negotiated peace treaties and other treaties. It is well within their power and according to the Constitution. 3, there is a concern over communist control of international organizations. Again, the 1920s was not a time where America started to worry about communism. Choice 4, the Treaty of Versailles did not punish Germany enough. Again, this has nothing to do with the League of Nations, right? So the main reason for this opposition is because people didn't want American citizens and the rest of the U.S. government didn't want America to get involved in another war and in European business. So number 19 asks us, as Secretary of Labor, what was Frances Perkins' primary role in the Roosevelt administration? So let's read this text. It says she reminded FDR of her role in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Public Works Program and the labor aspects of the National Industrial Recovery Act. She reminded him that he had entrusted her with research, legislative program, popularization, and establishment of unemployment insurance, old age pension, and welfare program. She described how she had reduced child labor in America, minimized workplace accidents, and converted the Bureau of Labor Statistics into a trusted source of information. The Fair Labor Standards Act brought the minimum wage and the concept of a 40-hour work week and paying for overtime. She greatly expanded the U.S. Consolidation Service in dealing with strikes, and she dealt with many labor questions during the war when skilled manpower was vital and women moved to formerly male jobs. So, as Secretary of Labor, what was Frances Perkins' primary role in the Roosevelt administration? Well, she's involved in making sure that the government is supporting businesses that are fair. This whole blurb is telling us how she worked in countless business administration positions, right? She was in the National Industry Recovery Act. She was in the Conservation Corps. These are all programs that were created to help Americans get jobs, help Americans keep jobs, and help Americans make money during the Great Depression. So she advised the president on many aspects of economic relief and reform. Remember, the Conservation Corps, the Public Works Program, and the National Industrial Recovery Act were all acts and initiatives started by FDR to get America out of the Great Depression. Right? The stock market crashed so hard that almost no one had jobs. Everyone was poor. People were starving, and no one was offering paid positions anymore, right? Because what's the point of working if there's no more money left anywhere in the country? So it became the role of the U.S. government to create those jobs and to support their own citizens. That's where FDR steps in. The Public Works Program was the reason why the Hoover Dam was created and why countless roadways in America and bridges were created. The government was like, okay, fine, if you guys can't find a job, work for the government, help us build bridges and dams, and we'll pay you. Same thing with the Conservation Corps and the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? All of these were the government's attempt of getting people back into the labor force and getting America's industrial labor and industrial market back into full speed, right? The person who oversaw all of these was the Secretary of Labor. So if she's overseeing all of these acts which are trying to bring economic recovery into the United States, that means that she had to advise the president on many aspects of economic relief and reform, right? She is not opposing factory safety regulations. In the text, she literally supported reducing child labor in America and making sure that office and workspaces were safe. She did not oppose deficit spending because all of FDR's position was deficit spending. The U.S. government also didn't have any money to pay these people, but they decided that it would be okay to borrow more money that the U.S. government could make if it meant being able to restore the economy, right? So deficit spending is when the U.S. government spends more money than it generates through taxes. FDR was big on deficit spending because he said, well, if we manage to make America and we managed to get the American workers back on their feet and back in their jobs, the new tax revenue that we'll generate from there will pay off the deficit or the debt that we're going into right now to give them all that money. And this has nothing to do with foreign policy, which is why choice 4 is off. 20 asks, what were two of the New Deal's permanent legacies that Frances Perkins helped create? So that's going to be the Social Security Administrations and the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Federal Housing Administration and the Tennessee Valley Authority has nothing to do with this. This has nothing to do with Tennessee or housing. This has something to do with labor. 2, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Public Works Program. This also has nothing to do with this. Sure, the FDIC was created during this time, but that wasn't Frances Perkins' work. Remember that she described how she had reduced child labor in America, minimized workplace accidents, and converted the Bureau of Labor Statistics into a trusted source of information. The Fair Labor Standards Act brought about the minimum wage, right? So she made the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? That was her. So one of her legacies has to be the thing that she literally created. She made the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? She expanded the U.S. Consolation Service in dealing with strikes, and she dealt many labor questions during the war when skilled manpower was vital and women moved into formerly male jobs. This service right here was later developed into the United States Social Security Administration, which helped people when they were unemployed and helped people get retired, right? So obviously the two legacies had to be the two things that she actually created, which they literally told us what she did in this text, right? So they talked about the Social Security Administration and the Fair Labor Act. Lend-Lease and National Recovery Act, these are false. The Lend-Lease Act is a foreign policy, right? That's our relationship with Europe during World War II, where we, and especially Britain, where we were lending them military equipment in exchange for money, right? Frances Perkins had nothing to do with the war. She had nothing to do with our foreign policy. She had something to do with how we recovered from the Great Depression. 21 asks, which foreign policy supported the goals expressed in the passage? So it says, it is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist the return of normal economic health to our world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so that it permits the emergence of political and social conditions which free institutions can exist. Such assistance, I am convinced, must not be on a piecemeal basis as various crises develop. Any assistance that this government may render in the future should provide a cure rather than a mere partial relief. Any government that is willing to assist in the task of recovery will find full cooperation. I am sure that on the part of the United States government, any government which maneuvers to block the recovery of other countries cannot expect help from us. Furthermore, governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery in order to profit, therefore politically or otherwise, will encounter the opposition of the United States. So, again, 1947, this is at the end of the world. This is a part of the act which is supposed to guide Europe towards recovery. So at the end of World War II, Europe is absolutely devastated. It's all destroyed. It's all bombed. All the fighting in Europe has just decimated it. And what the U.S. government decides to do is, well, we can't just make Nazi Germany pay reparations like we did in the First World War. We actually need to help rebuild all of Europe. So what America is going to do is it's going to pour millions and millions of dollars into Europe to help rebuild all those roads, to help rebuild all those buildings, bring back food, bring back jobs, so that Europe can actually flourish after this world. So what is supported by this? Well, it has to be containment. Why? Because at the end of the World War, America and the Soviet Union were kind of left as the two big contenders for world power. And what the United States was very scared of happening was that Russia and the Soviet Union would come in and repave Europe, right? And all the European countries would then turn into a communist government. So what the Americans wanted to do was they wanted to prevent the spread of communism, right? They feared that because the world was destroyed, because Europe was destroyed, they would all turn to communism because they had no more money. So they wanted to establish capitalism through aid so that Europe would stay capitalistic and aligned with America, right? So containment is the policy where we limit the spread of communism. Expansionism is false. Big stick is also false. Big stick policy is America having a very strong military but trying to resolve things through diplomacy. Expansionism would be true if we were trying to colonize Europe, but that's not what's happening. And two, open doors also false here. Number 22, Secretary of State George C. Marshall's plan was partly a response to what? Well, the whole reason why we want to pour so much money into Europe is because there's the occupation of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. We need to show the rest of Europe, who is super vulnerable, who are really going to take any help they need, that they need to take the help of the U.S. government, right? They can't rely on the help of the Soviet Union. Why? Because if they rely on the help of the Soviet Union, they'll turn communist, and we don't want them to turn communist. But officially, what we want to do is we want to aid Europe, right, in quotation marks, aid, quote unquote aid, so that we we can get them to support our ideals of capitalism, right? So again, the fact that the Soviet Union was expanding in Europe really scared American lawmakers. The Warsaw Pact, they see them unifying the rest of Eastern Europe. So America is like, we need to help Western Europe so that Western Europe doesn't fall to communism. Right? Marshall's Plan had nothing to do with the creation of the United Nations, and it had nothing to do with independence movements throughout Africa. It had something to do with Europe. And choice 3, isolationist sentiments in the United States is false. Right? Marshall wanted the United States to be an active member in the reconstruction of Europe. That is not isolationist. Right? Isolationist would be true if he wanted America to stay far away from Europe. That's not the case here. Right? Number 23 says, in this passage, Senator Smith argues that those who question an individual's loyalty to the United States should be reminded that what? So let's read it. For those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in the clear character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism. The right to criticize, the right to uphold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. The exercise of these rights should not cost one single American citizen his reputation or his right to livelihood, nor should he be in danger of losing his reputation or livelihood merely because he happens to know someone who upholds unpopular beliefs. Of those, of us does not. Who of us does not? Sorry about that. Otherwise, none of us could call or tell we have souls of our own. Otherwise, thought control would have set in. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds, lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it is not exercised by others, right? So this senator is arguing that our fear of communism is so great that it's taking away from what makes us American, right? People are so afraid of communism and so big on supporting America or being American that whenever they see someone supporting something that's not the American way, they get labeled a communist and they kind of get ousted and singled out as un-American, right? So this is dealing with the Red Scare, right? America's very big fear of the spread of communism. Everyone wants to be super American. No one wants to be un-American. Communism is viewed as un-American, and if you don't support America with 100%, then people would look at you differently. You'd be labeled as a communist where you're actually not a communist. So his whole thing is that this hatred and this fear is going way too far. We're forgetting what makes us American. The fundamental part of our government, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, is that we can criticize and protest and hold unpopular beliefs without being judged or discriminated against. But this new wave of red fear and red scare in America is making us forget those values. So the correct answer for 23 then has to be 3, right? Senator Smith argues that those who question an individual's loyalty to the United States should be reminded that Americans have have the right to their own opinions, even if those opinions are unpopular. So he's saying, like, what right do you have to call me un-American if I'm expressing or using my first American right of the freedom of speech? 24 asks, this 1950 Declaration of Conscience speech by Senator Smith was written in response to what? Well, it had to have been written in response to Senator Joseph McCarthy's unproven accusations of treason, right? The person who really perpetuated the Red Scare was Joseph McCarthy. He was the one who says that, well, a lot of America was infiltrated with communism, that communism was rampant in America, there were spies everywhere, that communism was going to overtake Americans, that if you weren't entirely American and aligned under American beliefs, you would be overtaken and, infected with communism, and the country would fall apart. So Joseph McCarthy was the main scarer of Americans against communism, right? Why? Because when he started to talk about communism and oppose communism, it gave him a lot of votes in the Senate, and he got elected to the Senate. It made him extremely popular. He wasn't from like a significant state, Joseph McCarthy. So it put him on the political map, his speeches and rants against communism, right? So he used it for personal gain. And of course, his statements about communism, about America being infiltrated and overrun by it, were never proven, right? He was oftentimes lying in his speeches just to be more popular and win more votes. So 25 says, as a result of the Supreme Court decision, the court ordered what? Well, we don't need to read this. We can just read the bottom right here. It says Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, right? So Brown v. Board of Ed pretty much said that everyone has an opportunity to education, right? So it's saying that public schools across the nation should be integrated with all deliberate speed, right? So it's unconstitutional to, make certain schools in certain areas underfunded than other schools, right? Compulsory school attendance had great expenditures for education. Both demonstrate a recognition and the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most public responsibilities, even services in armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today, it is a principal instrument in the awakening of the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to normally adjust to his environment. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity where the state has undertaken to provide is a right which must be made available on all equal terms, right? We come to the question presented. The segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority of equal opportunities? We believe that it does. So pretty much it is unfair to discriminate against education based on race, right? It's unfair that white kids, would have better schooling and better training, and more resources than black kids, and it's unfair to segregate, black kids in black schools from white kids in white schools, right? So 26 asks which government action further prompted equality in the United States, and that obviously has to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 even granted even more freedoms to African Americans and other minorities in America, and it further condemned racism, just like Brown v. Board of Education did. Choice 3, establishing Jim Crow laws, is the complete opposite. Plessy v. Ferguson was also the complete opposite, and the ending of affirmative action programs is the opposite, right? This would not promote equality. So that's all. So here, this is a photo of the White House on October 26, 2001. So this is after 9/11. We see, President Bush and other individuals signing what seems to be the Patriot Act, and it was a direct response to international terrorism, right? So following the attacks of September 11th, the Patriot Act was signed into action to kind of detect and monitor the possible harmful people that are residing within America, right? So it gave the government kind of exclusive rights to investigate and to wiretap and to look into people that they thought were involved in the September 11 attacks, because people were trying to figure out, who did this to America. And the unfortunate consequence of this was that it threatened civil liberties, right? So one impact of the Patriot Act was it threatened civil liberties. The United States government all of a sudden could, wiretap your phone. It could investigate you without giving you some sort of warrant. So people were trying to investigate these attacks and prevent further terrorism within the country. But again, it came at the cost of infringing upon people's rights, right? It came upon the effect was that you lost your freedom of security, right? You couldn't really operate as your own person because the U.S. government was watching over you, right? So I apologize for the very long explanation for this entire section. I'm not really feeling that well, but we have made it to the end of the first part. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. If you want me to go over another part of this test or another test altogether, please let me know in the comments down below what I should go over next. If you have any questions, again, just leave them down. If you like this video, please leave a like, and I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you have a nice day.